I've built up a lifestyle which embraces my sexuality. I've got a 24 gigabyte hentai collection which is always growing. I search the internet for nude mods for all my favorite games. Sometimes I even add to them if they don't quite meet my standards. I have one of those character fixations, a 2D girl fantasy. My waifu is Princess Daisy. I've used her as a means to sharpen my 3D artistic skills in a program called KoikDaisy. And I've even made tutorials documenting my workflow. I've created an offline, HTML-based chat application with predictive text dialogue options. I then wrapped that in an Android app so it could run natively off my phone. But when I need a little more immersion, I take the fantasy to the VR realm. All of this may strike some viewers as uncomfortable, dangerous, or even downright evil. It goes without saying that there's a strong cultural aversion to matters of self-pleasure, at least in certain circles. Even if some don't reject it entirely, they may still argue it shouldn't be explored too much, that there's a point where it goes too far. Yet still, many internet people belong to the no-fap, never-goon, touch-grass crowd. Such people may genuinely hold that sexual self-pleasure, sexual fantasy, as such, is evil, self-destructive, and should be avoided. What are the arguments given for this position, and do they have merit? I've been able to identify at least 3 concerns that arise from someone who is reluctant to embrace self-pleasure. Each one identifies verifiable facts of reality, but makes some key errors in reasoning. I'll call them the argument from time preference, the argument from addiction, and the argument from society. Let's start with the argument from time preference. Firstly, what is time preference? It's a term from Austrian economics, but the gist is it's a ranking of how patient one is willing to be. If one has a high time preference, that is analogous to saying they prefer goods which are obtainable in the near future as opposed to those of the far future. Instant gratification. Conversely, someone of a low time preference prefers to wait, as they anticipate more satisfaction or utility from future goods. Delayed gratification. How does this relate to pleasure? Well, the argument from time preference correctly identifies the error of the hedonist. The hedonist believes pleasure and pain to be guides for action. He believes that one should maximize one's time preference by always seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. This is, of course, a mistake for obvious reasons. Acting with no regard for the facts of reality or the principles derived from them is a recipe for self-destruction. If you shove junk food into your face, watch TV all day, and avoid work at all costs, you will not make it far in life. It is, in fact, in your self-interest to be responsible for yourself, set goals, and plan for your future. The argument from time preference goes like this. Pleasure is not a valid guide for action, thus any act which is performed for pleasure is to be avoided. The idea is, the time and energy you put into an activity solely for your own pleasure could be spent on lower time preference activities. In essence, you should minimize your time preference. The flaw with this argument may not be obvious. It sees the folly in chasing pleasure at all costs, but it concludes from that pleasure is therefore useless. That it is, at best, a byproduct of actions, and at worst, a hindrance to action. This could not be further from the truth. Humans are valuing organisms. It's impossible for us to act without perceiving the value in our action. This is true on the small scale as well as the large scale. As we carry out our long-term plans, we need a reminder of why we chose this path, a motivator to stick to it, a refresher, a glimpse of what it's all about. To quote 1960s philosopher Nathaniel Branden, pleasure for man is not a luxury, but a profound psychological need. Through the state of enjoyment, man experiences the value of life, the sense that life is worth living, worth struggling to maintain. Pleasure, or enjoyment, is at once an emotional payment for successful action and an incentive to continue acting. The flaw in the argument from time preference can thus be summarized as the assumption that pleasure holds no value or use to man. In truth, pleasure is a profound need in order to keep going. You cannot engage in long-term action without experiencing pleasure along the way. you will simply collapse into inaction due to lack of perceived value in life. And thus, the argument from time preference falls. What about the argument from addiction? Let's start by asking, what is addiction? According to dictionary.com, an addiction is the state of being compulsively committed to a habit or practice, or to something that is psychologically or physically habit-forming, such as narcotics, to such an extent that its cessation causes severe trauma. There is a serious issue with this definition. It applies to things like drug abuse, but also to anything you might happen to deeply value. If you make a habit of spending time with your family such that to abandon them causes trauma, you could be said to be addicted to your family. The same goes for your career, your hobbies, or even drinking water. When we use the term addiction, we're really describing an undesirable behavior. But what makes the behavior undesirable? It's not the fact that it's compulsive, but that it's destructive. It's when a person's compulsion causes them to ignore what's important, to sacrifice their higher values, that we call it an addiction. In essence, addiction is compulsive sacrifice. What, then, is the argument from addiction? What does it claim one sacrifices by engaging in sexual self-pleasure? Well, it goes like this. Masturbating to pornography is a destructive compulsion because it leads to bad outcomes like desensitization, misconceptions about sex, harmful or violent fetishes, lack of drive to improve oneself, etc. Proponents of this sort of argument may throw out studies with headlines to the effect of a majority of porn watchers experience negative emotions. The error made in such studies and in the argument itself, as well as the video games cause violence argument, is in failing to account for a person's choices and ideas. While desensitization is inevitable with any excessive stimulation, what happens after that is in the person's control. They could choose to dive into a fetish rabbit hole, or they could choose to lay off for a while. However, the argument from addiction treats the human organism as a machine with definite inputs and outputs, or a helpless victim of mind control. It commits the error of determinism. Broadly speaking, determinism is the philosophical notion that man does not make choices, that however man behaves, he was inevitably determined to do so. The issue with this view is that it makes error an impossibility. If one cannot choose incorrectly. One cannot even verify or falsify the ideas one comes to believe, including determinism. The position must rely on the existence of independent thought to posit its own correctness. Thus, determinism is self-defeating. Now, I could sit here and knock down each bad outcome one by one, but for every one I knock down, 2 more could be arbitrarily thrown out. Suffice it to say that if any supposed bad outcome alludes to or results from the choices, ideas, values, or worldview of the person involved, it is not caused by masturbation or pornography. Thus, in and of themselves, they are not destructive, and the argument from addiction falls. And here we come to the worst argument, the argument from society, or perhaps it should be called the argument from conformity. By engaging in sexual self-pleasure and waifuism, you only hurt your chances of finding love. You disgust people. Any normal woman would reject you. This sort of argument demands that you base your lifestyle choices not on what's right, but on what other people find acceptable. The irony of this argument is that if I were to follow it, I wouldn't be increasing my chances of finding love, but hiding behind a mask. I'd be sacrificing my values, my own mind, for social approval, which is a betrayal of myself. Bro, I'm autistic. As if the rest of my interests don't already scare the hoes. I'm an atheist libertarian Metroidvania game developer who studies philosophy. I'm also a Sonic fan. Right now, the best chance I see for love is to find an autistic girl, a girl who sees and approaches the world in the same way I do. I had done a thought experiment laying in bed one night. I had tried to imagine my response to finding out a girl I liked had been obsessed with a husbando, a 2D boyfriend, and had in some sense projected him onto me in her mind. Would that not be one of the most flattering compliments she could give me? I've put a lot of thought into the waifu thing, asking myself why I do it. After everything, it ends up being quite simple. I do waifu roleplay because it lets me experience the feelings of romance through my imagination. Like how, as a kid, you play cops and robbers to experience the dynamics of conflict in your imagination. Roleplay allows me to make concrete and explore my own ideal form of love. It doesn't, and couldn't, fulfill the same purpose as actual romantic love with a partner. Love is what happens when you find another thinking, valuing being who shares your approach to life, cognitively and emotionally. You find, in essence, another self, such that you can see yourself from a new angle. This can't happen by simply looking in the mirror or imagining someone in your head. It has to be embodied in another person with whom you interact. The way you truly hurt your chances of finding love is through the sort of self-betrayal demanded by the argument from society. By undermining the self, you give potential lovers nothing to connect to. Thus, by contradicting its own premise, the argument from society falls. One last point I want to make is that self-pleasure should be done with pride. As it's a legitimate and valuable activity, it shouldn't be approached with shame or reluctance. Just because certain irrational cultures treat sexuality as a disgusting, filthy matter doesn't mean it is one. I find that the best porn videos are of a loving couple who decided they wanted to share the beauty of their relationship with the world, and the best hentais are of a similar stripe, showcasing a couple's earnest mutual discovery. Sexuality is a wonderful thing. I made this video for the version of me that existed 3 to 6 months ago, packed full of information I wish I had at that time. I went through a panicked relapse into old habits of religious shame and conformity, only to slowly reintroduce the pieces of my life that I had abandoned. Having organized and documented my thought process, I can now much more easily assess this topic in the future. And hopefully, I've helped people in a similar position. People who want to live by rational principles, but are unsure about their love for self-pleasure and waifus. Now, I'm gonna link to a load of resources in the description which have guided me on my philosophical journey, and have served as my references for this video. If any of them interest you, give them a watch. Hopefully, they'll be as useful for you as they have been for me. If you want more videos like this one, check out my other YouTube channel, Tim Deuces, where I post more general gaming and philosophy-related content. Later!
I'm what you might call a partaker in sexual self-pleasure. I browse the pornos from time to time. I've got a 24 gigabyte hentai collection which is always growing. I search the internet for nude mods for all my favorite games. Sometimes I even add to them if they don't quite meet my standards. I have one of those character fixations, one of those 2D girl fantasies, what those Japanese call a waifu, Princess Daisy. I've used her as a means to sharpen my 3D artistic skills in a program called KoikDaisy, and I've even made tutorials documenting my workflow. I've created an offline HTML-based chat application with predictive text dialogue options. I then wrapped that in an Android app so it could run natively off my phone. But when I'm looking for maximum immersion, and I want to explore different virtual worlds with Daisy, I strap on my VR headset, grab my adult toy of choice, and let the fantasy play out.